Guess I'll join the ranks and do a bit on this Occupy quest, solution mission. Yeah, this is way overdue, but that's just the way it is, it seems. Yeah, combination of work and demotivation on my part. So apologies for that, as always. I mean, I'm apologizing, but I know the demotivation is perfectly warranted, considering the state of affairs. Um, I'll try to avoid all this noise regarding the right to protest in the US under what specific terms and limits and criteria. You know, as long as it's this specific angle, like 400 feet west of the vicinity of this, that, or the other, then it's okay. Yeah, if you're expecting that kind of a video, Zuccotti Park and all that, might as well click off immediately, since that's not the video I'm making, because I haven't seen that many people bitch about it, to be honest, outside of a few anal retentive YouTube crowds within the circles around here. And I'm anal retentive too, but even I can put some of that in perspective. And I'll also skip the police brutality and just all the other well-established items, or at least what I perceive to be well-established or even over-established at this stage. And a general rundown of what that includes is the non-necessity of pretty much every bailout to date, the blatant necessity for Supreme Court term limits, shorter congressional limits on the Senate side of things, instead of this 6-year crap they got going now. Corporate personhood, runaway pay. I mean, especially those two, since I've documented their ins and outs a few times before. So I really do want to try to avoid making this into a rerun video. So let's see. It's been over 3 months now since the movement officially kicked off, and I haven't seen too many people address the substance of the ideology clashes within. And I think that's really what's got to be dealt with, the within stuff. The elements which resemble the old international working class movement versus the tame sort of, oh, let's just fix this, and that, and call it a day, and go eat ice cream, which I'm actually more partial to. And it solidifies to me that internal dissent is where the substantive arguments are going to lie. Because anyone criticizing just the mere idea that a protest of this magnitude is warranted, that's, I mean, you might as well just tattoo charlatan on your forehead and just be done with it. Because it's pretty obvious what that is. And that propaganda does have weight, mainly because the protesters, the very people who are the most eager to showcase it for the propaganda that it is, I've noticed how they do tend to fall for little stereotype traps that they've had set up for them quite neatly, it seems. Since they don't seem to have any concept or appreciation of what it means to be obliged to make the argument in ways that appeal not only to the sensibilities of the downtrodden or to the aspiring Robin Hoods of today, some of who, by the way, strike me as though they're mainly in it for the self-aggrandizement. So yeah, you can't just target those people. You also have to go out of your way to, regardless of how tedious it may be, you have to go out of your way and make attempts to appeal to elitist sensibilities. Elite in the sense of outlook, not necessarily actual status. Although it certainly wouldn't hurt to sway people with power and connections. But what is it now? Over 100 days and counting, and anyone who appears to be in favor of any of this, and who actually has some stroke, to me it seems that they're just lip servicing the more reasonable demands, the common ground demands that sprung forth since the beginning. So when I see protesters interviewed and they knee-jerkishly react to just predictable verbiage coming from Fox anchors, for instance, the superficial perception of what that knee-jerk reaction entails, I think it's a safe bet that this will be the sole impression that the viewers of outlets like Fox are going to be left with. It's their modus operandi. So you want to try to avoid being a reactionary, regardless of how obnoxious the talking heads are being to you, since it is their job to try to narrow in on the reactionary protesters and their mentalities. So that's just something you're going to have to expect. And just try not to do what Cornel West did about a month back when he had those real-time debates with a few of the apologists and was visibly shaken up and just completely cognitively disoriented by the rather generic and predictable verbiage. apologetics that they threw his way, because that just made it look like he's hearing the arguments for the first time. And so even I immediately thought back to the Hitchens line, the now famous line that he used on Hannity following, what's his face, the guy who died in 2007, the Reverend guy, his name escapes me now, but yeah, Hitchens came on to do an interview with Hannity about him, Falwell. And the line sort of fits, and that line, of course, is the, you strike me as someone who's never read any of the arguments against your position, good sir. Which could have very well been the case with Mr. Cornel West, as well as with some of the younger occupiers now. But it's still no excuse in my book, since these are about the arguments that are being presented to them are about as by the numbers as it gets when it comes to your pull yourselves by your bootstraps type of caveman talking points. And there's a ton of job creationist talking points thrown in there as well. So it really shouldn't be that difficult to not be taken off guard. And if it does take you off guard, maybe just don't do interviews with motor mouth spin doctors unless you're the type of person who can pull off talking circles around them. Or it's just not going to do your cause any damn good. But I will link in the underbar some demographics about the protesters, statistics and all that. Just contains percentages in terms of who fits into what one-dimensional bubble, Republican, Democrat, Independent, just all the label-oriented crap in case you're curious about those, which I'm not. I think, especially here on YouTube, considering the sheer range of viewers from all over the world nowadays, more than ever now, from places where so many of these labels end up doing a 180. Now, I understand that the movement is still in its infancy, sort of quasi-infancy, I guess. But based on some of the demands I've seen, of course there's good stuff in there, like Glass-Steagall Act and reinstating it, or reinstating aspects of it at least. But then you get to the $20 an hour minimum wage stuff. And that's going to be my big crime here, I guess, is that I do want to know every last inch of every last demand coming from every last denomination. And it's frustrating that this is viewed as some kind of backhanded attempt to undo or curtail the momentum, because it's not. It's only fair to be curious about the precise percentage of people who think that this is in any way viable, considering the overall brink of collapse environment that we are in right now. And if this were the only silly demand, then okay, fine, I'd look the other way. It certainly won't cripple business if it was the only one, but it's not the only one. There's still a lot more of them. And I guess I should have compiled up a list, because I can't recall all the other ones off the top of my head, but they are out there. And I mean, yeah, I am one of these people who likes to distinguish between agendas. When something like this comes up, preferably sooner than later, distinguish. And that is going to result in more internal dissent, but at least it's going to be healthy dissent, not dissent over sensationalism. And I'll get into the sensationalism later on. And I guess, the other thing that this movement prides itself on is that after all this time, they still don't really have one spokesperson. And immediately, you just got to think civil rights movement and how it would have all gone down had it not been for Martin Luther King's rhetorical contributions. I guess Michael Moore has some speeches. I guess he's made the most speeches, but that can actually bite the movement in the ass, because he's not all that consistent. I did see an interview with him where he casually played ball with the sentiments that capitalism is in no way truly present in the US, and this is all just a manifestation of corporatism. And you're thinking, well, what the hell? I mean, the guy releases a film 2 years ago with the word capitalism in the title, and the entire thing is predicated around the fact that the US is indeed a capitalist country. And so what, fast forward 2 years and he just casually accepts someone else calling it something completely different? So even progressives now are going to eat up all these cat and mouse bullshit games about how, if it ain't free market, if it ain't completely deregulated, if it ain't laissez-faire capitalism or anarcho-capitalism even, you just can't call it capitalism. And so yoink, enter corporatism. even though it's by definition still a for-profit, private sector dominated economy. It's somehow going to be a crime of terminology to call it capitalism. Because the government still does things like way over there. So yeah, that makes room for some overlap, obviously, thus rendering the capital and ownership at hand as being entirely crony. Because yeah, we've whipped out alternative definitions packed with convenient restraints. So yeah, let's use them. We didn't whip them out back in 1989. No. We did it once the shit hit the fan. And you do get this with communists too, anarcho-communists, who try to brand all things Soviet Union as exclusive to just Leninism or Stalinism, and they won't use the communist label to describe it. Pretty much saying if it ain't anarcho-communism, you can't call it communism. So it essentially just renders the anarcho term utterly redundant. So why play that game? What? Because Marx said so, that's right. Because it's been written. Century-year-old prediction regarding a specific stateless outcome, a highly unlikely outcome that should have been apparent even back then, whereby human nature is synonymous to altruism. There's no weight there. All indications point to that being impossible, so just let it go already. We should be able to improvise on certain terminology, like we've done with countless other terms that have been coined in eras that are now alien to us. So yeah, neither capitalism nor communism need to be in their stateless incarnations in order to be used as legit terms. And if more is going to be the Martin Luther King here, it's going to be a rough ride, because he just provides way too much fodder. And he is another one of these people who flip-flops on the term free market itself, because sometimes he'll say it as if there is a free market right now in the US, and then sometimes he'll, quote as he's using the term, as he's saying free market. So what the hell's the point of that? Make up your fucking mind, because you're not doing your argument any damn good by trying to play it both ways. But yeah, looking at those demographics and then looking at the smear job of the movement in general, summing it up as being comprised of lazy shitheads and nothing else, yeah, it's been somewhat effective. I know even here you bring it up and some people are going to scoff. So if you're surprised that it's been effective in the States, well, yeah, that's just going to reveal your unrealistic expectations, especially since the smear job of the Tea Party, which did a pretty good job of, caricaturing them as nothing but a racist redneck movement, that was also quite effective. And dare I say, it played a pretty damn good role in shutting down what was, at the time, around 2007, 2008, it was a pretty neat platform for some much needed nationwide coverage. Not coverage of the birthers crap and the certificate shit, but arguments about the actual cures versus band-aids, and for all you know, getting apolitical Joe fuckwits to at least be made aware of its existence as a credible contender, as a challenge to the status quo. You may have seen some more average Joes on their toes, and that may have brought about some more productivity in the voting booth. It was a movement with an underlying gripe that was founded on a lack of Darwinian economic policies, not certificates and all that other crap. So, a few policies were, even the cures were common ground, mainly consisting of foreign affairs sort of crap, but still, it was a decent opportunity to have the argument on the airways and on the grand scale, sort of. And looking back now, over these last 4 years, it seems that lots of people were content just distracting away from it. Everything was just so polarized because the worst elements of the Tea Party were constantly fed to people, and people ate it up. So there is something to be said about how now, when some of these overgeneralized Tea Partiers are the ones doing the generalizing and caricaturing the Occupy movement as nothing but unemployed bums and hipsters, oh, now it's a trespass. So let's throw a hissy fit and just let the irony evade us. And I'm not saying there's anywhere near as many nutcases within Occupy as there are within the Tea Party, obviously. But that's besides the point. Okay, so don't mistake this for some diplomatic 50-50 guilt trip, because with the Tea Party you get a lot of stuff that you simply don't with Occupy. You get the corporate sponsorship, and I can go down the list forever. But at the same time, there are other people who are just committed to avoiding any partisan politics, not because it's unwarranted, but because people are so consumed with making themselves out to look like they're above it all by not being susceptible to any us versus them approach. And while there is a lot of that, probably a bit too much in the media, a lot of it is perfectly warranted, and the middle ground folk gotta figure that out and pick a side at some point when it comes to at least the basics. And I guess the overall point I'm trying to make is that when people whose values make you want to hurl, when they rally around a non-mainstream cause and it actually gets picked up for mainstream attention throughout various outlets, it's completely counterproductive to treat it as a cartoon, and that's what people did. No, you use that as a platform to illustrate why their arguments and solutions are inferior, instead of making them out to be a circus act because you saw Olbermann and Bill Maher pull it off splendidly. And people are inspired by those comedians, and it's pretty aggravating because comedians aren't in it to represent reality, they're in it to exaggerate because that's what makes them money. You think Bill Maher actually wants to see America go back to being a great country, the number one country? You think he wants that? He gets nothing to gain out of that. And for that matter, neither does Olbermann or any of the other pundits. And the mockery will be reciprocated, and now Occupy is paying the price, seeing as how these reactionaries on the right have been made eager to eat up anything that's meant to poison the well, because this is exactly what the non-racist and the non-religious element of the Tea Party has been frustrated by on their end for so long. And I don't expect them to rise above it now. No, I expect them to take every cheap shot they can get and just fight fire with fire, eye for an eye, just make the whole world blind, so to avenge the slander of their positions by just going along with the broad brushing of this movement. And you'll get mouthpieces like Peter Schiff doing a stellar job, making the occupiers look dense, not just to his base, but to the casual observer as well, since casual viewers are just so accustomed to cartoon depictions of any political position, which are standard operating procedure now, given the SNL appeal and the Hollywood appeal. And if you happen to think that the casual viewers are hopeless anyway, just by the mere fact that they are blind enough to still be casual this late in the game, well, what can I say to that? I mean, if you can't see how that's always going to be our job to try and fix, then I guess I'll just have to add that as another obstacle to the list of 1,000,001 obstacles that I got going as it is. The focus should have always been on their arguments. Have them defend stuff like the perpetuation of relaxed tariffs in the wake of 50,000 US factories closing down within the last decade. Have them defend Clinton's repeal of, Clinton's butchering, really, of Glass-Steagall through the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of November 99. Have them defend these things in the name of small government. Make that the central focus. Just put it front and center and watch them fail as they do it. Don't make the main focus the birth certificate crap. Point out to the casual observers how when you dangle a carrot in front of banks and corporations, they'll snatch it within a nanosecond. That much even the casual people know. Of course, with the factory issue, the ideal solution is to simply crack down on exponential population growth, but even the occupiers have that somewhere at the bottom of their list, while the Tea Partiers have it on their shit list. I mean, they want to crack down on population reduction, which actually makes perfect sense from their prerogative, since overpopulation is perfect for he who owns the capital. It's a wet dream for them. And if occupiers don't get serious about that and make it one of their main issues, it's only going to be a matter of time. I mean, no amount of economic regulations or, restraints on imports and exports, commercial banks, none of that is going to save them from the cutthroat, just brutally competitive job environment that we're all headed for in a couple of decades, especially when technology renders even more positions obsolete, middle class positions. So even if the progressive agenda were to be implemented from A to Z, shit's gonna get very ugly very soon. And you're not gonna be able to subdue any of these inherent to humanity ills by piling on reforms. You're gonna have to have a cultural and philosophical reform, and those are even more out of reach. But as for the political cures, I mean, I've said it before, I'll say it again, even though it's kind of aggravating to have to repeat myself. But if you are committed to operating on an exclusively external basis, it's going to be impossible to suck out any of this poison that's built into the structure. You have to do it within the system. As much as people want to treat that as a drone statement, it holds true, as far as the West is concerned, at least. I mean, there are examples to the contrary in the West. Certainly the labor protest in the 30s, which sparked the New Deal. It's kind of similar to what's taken place right now, except there's no FDR to vote for, so it's all kind of pointless and futile. But the most recent non-FDR example that jumps out at me actually took place right here in BC in July 2010, just last year, when the harmonized sales tax was levied on us, which caught people off guard since the BC Liberal Party made no mention of its implementation in the months leading up to the 2009 election. And as a result of all the scathing, just the criticism, the relentless public backlash that Gordon Campbell experienced in the wake of the HST, he actually went ahead and voluntarily stepped down as the Premier of BC. And the HST went to a province-wide referendum, and it's going to be scrapped come 2012. So there have been examples where internally driven legislature caters to external backlash, and so people see a policy reversal that favors them. And despite this, you're always going to get generic anti-government rhetoric trying to gloss over these concrete examples where overwhelming public outrage did, in fact, make all the difference on fairly relevant issues. And the reason this may seem so underwhelming is because there are these mushy political activists out there who do build way too much confidence off of the type of example I just brought up. They behave as though these examples are commonplace, and sadly they're not. So while the victories are by no means unattainable, as the anti-government hyenas would have you believe, expecting them to come to fruition just because of the past or because you've organized and you have a list of demands and they're specific demands and you're angry and you're not going to take it anymore and you all learn to chant in unison and it's really cute and even hunger strikes now, that all may be just chasing the wild goose. You never know. The deal breaker really does come down to having a large enough segment of the population that is, first of all, overwhelmingly unified and invested enough to be reasonably educated on the crucial facts. So not just the electorate, okay, but the public at large. And there's a few other ingredients, but people simply don't have time to educate themselves because they go and start families. And so they have to work two jobs and change diapers all night and go to Disneyland. But let's not criticize any of that, no. Let's just criticize the 1% and pretend that we're not committing a single villain fallacy by doing so. Just like the swindlers who try to absolve the 1% of any blame by placing all the blame on the government, just like they're also doing the same thing and committing the same fallacy, except they know it. So these aren't inherent flaws. But America does seem like a bit of an exception to the rule, primarily because of the immunity that so many government officials have given themselves that you don't have in a lot of these other countries that see these similar protests. Kind of like France and the 35-hour week protests that they managed to hold on to after all these decades. So if you want to see legit economic reform or any kind of reform, like for example, take a guy like Henry Paulson, who worked for Goldman Sachs initially as head of investment banking and was ultimately promoted as chief executive. And then 5 years ago, he was sworn in as Secretary of Treasury. So, I mean, just one of the many examples where a blatant conflict of interest went largely unchallenged and proved to be corrosive. So, if you want to highlight that, or let's go with something a bit more concrete. Let's say you want to prevent banks with federal deposit insurance from gambling with the depositors' money by putting it in the investment bank side. So if the goal is to split these two as separate branches of banking like they were before, but then you still go ahead and refuse to transfer your money into a credit union and people at large simply, continue refusing this, well then yeah, the only other option is to find someone to vote for. Of course, the Progressive Caucus still talks a good talk when it comes to banking reform, but they'll always be ineffective in the current climate, considering the people at the realm. Their influence is going to remain bleak, not just in terms of solutions, but also in terms of pushing for overdue prosecutions over the well-documented war crimes and repeated failures to sort out Guantanamo and the waterboarding. They're going to remain ineffective as usual. Bernie Sanders, senator guy, good guy, but just another verbiage guy with no apparent pull or connections when it comes to the upper echelons of the Justice Department. He's another one of these guys pushing for this proposal to pass constitutional amendments to end corporate personhood, end money as speech, as he says it, and just ultimately end lobbying and the excessive campaign donations, well, any campaign donations brought to you by revolving doors of big business. And there are restraints of that as it is. Not many people know about those restraints because they do seem fairly unnoticeable. And I really don't want to discourage any of that follow-up sort of restraints that people are trying to implement now. But it is going to be ineffective as long as your future dream candidate has a personal ethics code where back alley transactions are going to be acceptable alternative safe havens for Wall Street or just for a myriad of other behind closed doors types of scratch my back and 6 months down the road I'll scratch yours sort of bounties. So proposing an outright ban still beats proposing nothing. But as long as polygraphs are unreliable, or as long as they're as unpopular as they are now, the fact is going to remain that any public servant, any candidate, or just any member of Congress currently accepting bribes will find a way to accept them one way or another. Trying to put an end to this by making it illegal completely from A to Z, on every level illegal, it's no different than trying to prevent the existence of illicit drug cartels by cracking down on drugs Nixon style. The only real alternative is to, at some point, find an outraged, principled, politically savvy, politically capable group of people. Even just a handful of people would be enough if they're charismatic enough. People whose disgust and outrage matches yours, who have genuine reverence for the Jeffersonian sort of antagonism towards aristocratic elitism, or in this case, I guess, plutocratic elitism. And right now you don't have anything remotely approaching that. And if you did have something approaching that, then you wouldn't have to take the money out of government, because then you could feed the government, because the government would feed you back. And sadly right now, there's only a couple of candidates I can name off the top of my head, but I don't even have any faith in them either. Ralph Nader is sort of playing ball with Ron Paul right now, so it's just kind of disgusting and slimy. And Dennis Kucinich is, well, I'm not going to get into the specific candidates, because then this is going to be an even longer video, like a 10-hour video. It's been impossible to get legit people in, and people always say, well, would you turn down millions of dollars if Bob Diamond or Trump offered it to you? No, you wouldn't, so why would you expect anyone else to? Well, first of all, yes, I would. Okay, I would with ease turn it down. And I wouldn't even need a nifty congressman's salary to do so. I would turn it down this instant, even on my rinky-dink salary. And I know I'm not the only one. People know we're at a point now where there's way more determined, motivated people who are aware of the result of what happens when you accept these bribes. And having contempt for that doesn't make every last one of them impossible to elect. So there's nothing inherently broken here. Runoff elections are an easy fix to at least the early stages of that predicament. IRV, ranked choice voting, whatever you want to call it. Voting in the primaries wouldn't hurt either. And you'd think IRV, that this would be another one of their top priorities right next to overpopulation, but I don't think I've heard it mentioned by any of the people speaking publicly at a single one of these gatherings, these protests. So they're fucked. I mean, you're going to need a rational voting system set in motion before you can do anything. Not this, whatever this is, this archaic crap where the popular vote is routinely suppressed. If you look at polls right now and you stack up public opinion next to legislative bodies, you're going to see that they're perfect strangers. And history revisionists are succeeding at making it seem like these two have always been at odds to this extent, which is horseshit. It's been exacerbated in recent times. And frankly, this is the intended result of what happens when you render the popular vote ineffective. And I do need to do a separate video on the Electoral College, because it deserves its own rant. But yeah, two-party systems are just not going to offer any real candidate a halfway or a quasi-way realistic shot. And without that, Wall Street will continue pulling off funds and bounties regardless of how many laws you pass against it. They'll do it after dark, when the Obamas and the rest of them are in their jammies pretending to be sound asleep. They'll do it. So you don't have IRV, you don't rid yourself of the Electoral College virus. Everything else is really a non-starter, which is partly why I just don't bother anymore. And you get people who are apprehensive about this. They act like this archaic breed of democracy is, that's geographically oriented is preferable because they have this notion that local and state governments are just so much more simple to keep in check when they're not. It depends. I mean, municipalities are just as out of control as I've learned in my anecdotal experience, I guess. The only real positive is that they can't go and bomb Libya for no reason. But the court system, trying to combat due process violations, it just ends up being a huge waste of money, with the legal proceedings being delayed repeatedly and the judges having immunity, and if you're pro se, they'll throw your case out the window on bullshit technicalities because a lawyer isn't making any money. So it's just as broken on some levels as the federal branch. And I guess anytime you talk democracy, you're going to have the Franklin quote drones come along and give you their summation of democracy as two wolves in a lamb voting on what's for dinner. And don't get me wrong, as far as romanticized old-timey wisdom quotes are concerned, the one about democracy is the least retarded one that's regurgitated all the time. My favorite has got to be the humanitarian suggestion that those who are willing to sacrifice liberty for temporary security deserve neither. Now, ignoring the sociopathic overtones of that quote as it is perceived by the people today, obviously it's taken out of context when they talk about it today, but that's neither here nor there, because let's talk about the context that the people who quote it see it in. Even if the particular liberty at hand was actually proven to be worthy of preservation at the expense of the particular potential security that one would be correct to sacrifice, even then, you simply deal with the scenario by accusing the liberty sacrificer of being misguided, and maybe place a paper cap on him with the word dunce written on it and call it a day. But you don't go on to use his cognitive misfirings as justification for saying that he deserves to have harm inflicted on him. And that's essentially what the quote calls for. The quote as the people see it today, the people who are using it. Deserves neither. But then again, that's old-timey wisdom for you. If you can't outrun the lion, you deserve to be eaten by the lion, because you could outrun the fucker. So, and again, it's irrelevant anyway, because we know that on paper, it can be used to justify all sorts of broad stupidity that we know Franklin wouldn't justify, like letting people build missiles in their basement to protect themselves from Iran. Iran that's coming right at us, right? Based on what we're hearing now. No, there's a context to the quote, and the context comes down to technological primitivism, first of all, aside from the Pennsylvania, the colony crap that I'm not going to get into now. Here's the thing. I did take a stroll down to Occupy Vancouver on the 15th of October, which was, I believe, the inaugural day. And as I approached the marching, I heard him chanting the classic, "This is what democracy looks like" chant. And it did strike me as pious and just drenched in self-satisfaction and this is what the good guys look like sort of sentiments. And so even I find some of this democracy shit obnoxious, as if the underdog should be proud over the mere fact that he is an underdog. It doesn't annoy me that they are pro-democracy, it annoys me that they're so unwittingly proud of it. They romanticize it just like the Constitution drones romanticize the words of the founders and go on to delude themselves into believing that the US is capable of doing something that no other country in history has ever managed to pull off. And that's adhere to what it was initially set out to be upon its formation centuries later. No, it can't. And people just don't seem to appreciate that politics should be viewed as nothing but a bunch of lesser of evils choices, okay, based on one's value system. And it took less than 5 minutes of conversation with these people to see how it hasn't even dawned on them that when you strip all the corruption out of the way that's present in the system right now, you take all of that away and you focus on just the bare knuckle contrast of the ideologies within the movement. The ideologies are legitimately irreconcilable. And to go on about that irreconcilability as if it's some math equation that's ultimately solvable, that's akin to believing in a specific set of rights, I guess. Specific set of rights that's been conceived and just jotted down on a piece of paper somewhere, and how that set of rights is holy or axiomatic, when in reality, it's simply a social construct bound by arbitrary whim, always. And one of the main reasons it's bound by arbitrary whim is because the concepts like merit are largely disputable, being the intangible trains of thought that they are. If Old Man River is to posit that becoming a veteran in one's field of work is enough to deem that as some sort of a meritorious feat to which all other feats take a back seat, that's not concrete, that's not empiricism, that's Old Man River's call to make. Okay? But these people make it seem as though there's something more to it. So they delude themselves into thinking that things like tenure or seniority perks ought to be a universal right of every worker. And then you have the from dusk to dawn crowd, people who have this tunnel vision reverence for hard work and endurance and perseverance. And then most hilariously of all, you have people who still buy into mouthpieces like Peter Schiff. They believe that the preposterously rich have become preposterously rich by adding a preposterous amount of value to society, where the value added and the size of the wallet both gravitated upwards in tandem, as though the two were just dance partners. They're connected at the hip, right? Or otherwise, they couldn't have become this rich in the first place. No way, Jose. It just wouldn't have happened. In reality, we know that this is largely driven by various factors that have nothing to do with merit as most people would define it. Mainly the commercial factor, I think, first and foremost. Just look at Google, the way it does its indexing. It's a jackpot system where, you get a little popular, a little ahead of the rest, just a bit so that you stick out, and Google takes over from there. It skyrockets you. Users like Fred didn't add any value to the internet. They were at the right place at the right time and tapped into the right environment. And Google played ball. There's millions of kids who can do what Fred did. And then the kids who actually ended up watching him are the ones who clicked the ads because the ads were placed right in front of their noses. And they're kids. And that's just the internet. And you also have the Kevin Trudeaus of the world making great money off of their alternative medicine scams. And then there's all sorts of scams that sell really well. I'll just go with the alternative medicine example because I think most people here are educated enough about the basics of medicine to be able to recognize it for the scam that it is and to not contest this as an example. But there's people who are gullible and who will be willing to buy anything as long as it's marketed right. And other financial claims to fame include immensely disproportionate bargaining power between employees and employers. But that's, like I said, partly the fault, or well, maybe not partly, maybe primarily the fault of the resource deprived employees who saw fit to have too many damn kids and to just keep thrusting them into these increasingly cutthroat environments where the kid just ends up being fodder for the capital 9 times out of 10. And we know statistically this is the predicted outcome. And then there's the disproportionate purchase power, the nepotism, and all these tend to be afterthoughts, if they even register as thoughts at all. So yeah, there's all these different ideas about what constitutes as merit, but the point remains that even though I would like to think that mine is the absolute correct one, I know that we can't really pin this stuff down and pretend that, you know, our particular juxtaposition of priorities masquerading as axioms are the only correct ones. And that is why, even without the corruption, all of this is legitimately irreconcilable in the end. And it doesn't mean the argument shouldn't take place. It just means that there's a certain spectrum here. And then you get into the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and that is a very tricky spectrum to define.